Last Sunday night, RT aired a midnight liturgy for the Feast of the Nativity, essentially an Orthodox Christian Christmas Eve Mass from Moscow. And there was a woman offering English interpretation of a Russian commentary on what was transpiring in that liturgy. And a little less than an hour in, there was some brief but interesting discussion on the differences between the Gospels. So I wanted to make a quick video on that subject. I'll play here the clip, and I invite you to listen in particular to what is said about the Gospel of John vis-a-vis the three before it.
So we have four Gospels. The first Gospel is the Gospels of Mark. He writes for the general audience. His Gospel is very short, very harsh. Sometimes it is believed to be very apocalyptic. He says that Christ is the Messiah, and he has unprecedented authority over demons and angels, over humans and forces of nature. But he went through unprecedented suffering and humiliation for the salvation of mankind. That's the main point that goes through Mark's Gospel. And Matthew had to prove to Jewish people that Christ is the Messiah awaited in the Old Testament. Luke addressed the Greek and the Roman audience, and in fact he wrote the history of Christ's coming and the history of the Church. And of course, we have the Gospels of John, which is very mystic Gospels. And in the first centuries of Christianity, it was considered a secret Gospel. It was read only for baptized people. First Christian couldn't even imagine that missionaries in the churches will quote the Gospels of John to everyone around. Only when you accepted Christ as God, you were allowed to hear these Gospels. It was then quite a different approach to this holy book.
Okay, what most intrigued me was the portion at the end about the Gospel of John. One does not have to agree with everything that was said to nonetheless see therein a valuable approach to popular questions about the four Gospels. See, it just so happens that these days there are polemicists who attempt to pit the Gospel of John against the Synoptic Gospels, arguing that John has material not found in the Synoptics because John is, quote-unquote, more theologically developed, which they mean is that John has more fiction because it was written at a later stage in a process of evolution of legendary material amongst Christians. Now, of course, these sorts of polemics traffic in mere speculation, but it can still be helpful to propose an alternative possible explanation for the differences that exist between the Gospels. The approach taken in that video clip from RT actually parallels an interesting argument proposed by the Greek Orthodox priest and scholar Ioannis Romanides in his book To Propatorikon Amartima. Here I will quote a relevant passage from George Gabriel's English translation of that book titled The Ancestral Sin. Starting on page 72, Father Romanides states the following, quote, "The Gospel of John has the mysteries as its basis, and as its purpose the correlation of the historic life of Christ with the present mysterial life in Christ and experience of the community. When we take into account that the Christians carefully and systematically avoided all discussions of the deeper meaning of the mysteries, not only with the hostile outside world, but even with the catechumens, then we are able to understand the use of the Gospels in the first church, and many of the problems raised by biblical criticism are solved. Since the baptized Christians did not discuss the mysteries even with the catechumens, it is sufficiently clear that the fourth gospel was used in the ancient church for completing and finishing the catechism of the recently illumined. that is, the newly baptized. It was particularly suited to this purpose and distinguished from the other Gospels mainly because of its clear dogmatic, mysterial, and apologetical tone. We do not find in John the systematic preparation of catechumens for baptism that is found in Matthew and Mark. This is why John does not begin with the baptism of Christ, but rather with, quote, "In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was made flesh," end quote. The attitude which both the clip from RT and the Romanides described can be found even as late as the 4th century, as in the Encyclical letter of the Council of Egypt, which is recorded in Athanasius' defense against the Arians. Bishops in Alexandria expressed alarm at the fact that the deeper mysteries of the faith were being exposed to catechumens and to non-believers. They stated the following, quote, "They are not ashamed to parade the sacred mysteries before the catechumens, and worse than that, even before heathens, whereas they ought to attend to what is written, 'It is good to keep close the secret of a king,'" end quote. That same letter goes on to say, quote, "We ought not then to parade the holy mysteries before the uninitiated, lest the heathen in their ignorance deride them, and the catechumens, being over-curious, be offended," end quote. So, understanding the Gospels as originally intended for different audiences at different stages of catechesis, Romanides sums up his position thusly, quote, "The differences between the Synoptics and the Gospel of John, therefore, are not disagreements, as many maintain. On the contrary, they clearly pertain to a difference in depth and fulfillment of the Synoptics by the fourth Gospel in accordance with the catechetical needs of the Church," end quote. It's worth noting that the practice of embargoing information is even alluded to in the Synoptic Gospels themselves, in particular the Gospel of Mark. For example, Mark 140-45, so chapter 1 of Mark, the 40th to the 45th verses, has a portion in which we are shown that one point of keeping aspects of Jesus' deeds and what they reveal about him secret is that such has a direct effect on the trajectory of his ministry. In the 4th chapter of Mark, in the 11th and 12th verses, we see that the use of parables was part of a deliberate strategy so that many people would have a less than full understanding of the truth. In the 11th chapter of Mark, the 27th to the 23rd verses, we see religious authorities trying to get Jesus to elaborate on his position, and Jesus subsequently using their own uncertainty as grounds for not being entirely explicit and forthcoming on the subject. In the trial scene in the 14th chapter of Mark, we see that once Jesus does speak openly about his self-identity, those same authorities are nearly floored and have apoplectic reactions. Ergo, it would seem his prior unwillingness to give them everything was not without good reason. The overall picture which Mark conveys to the reader is the idea that the truth is slowly revealed in pieces at their appropriate times, a la Ecclesiastes 3:7, with the deeper ideas being revealed at a later stage. Another relevant text is John 21:25, which states that if everything Jesus said and did was recorded, the text covering such would be far more vast than what we currently have. That means that John 21:25 is a biblical allusion to the fact that extant material is merely a small portion of a much larger cloud or corpus of tradition and truths about Christ and his ministry. This could also be inferred simply by looking at the word counts of the Gospels themselves. Note that there are slightly over 18,300 words in the Greek text of Matthew. There's approximately 11,300 words in Mark, and slightly under 19,500 words in Luke. This puts the total for the Synoptics at just over 50,000 words. Then there are slightly over 15,600 words in the Gospel of John. Only a portion of those words are actually quoting Jesus, and even without such numbers, those who are familiar with the text know that one could read all the words attributed to Jesus in the Synoptics or John in a matter of hours. Therefore, in the spirit of John 21:25, one must admit that these corpora of quotations must only reflect a small fraction of what would have been said over the course of a multiple years-long ministry. So, In conclusion, why is the Gospel of John different from the Synoptic Gospels? Why does the fourth Gospel have material not found in the first three Gospels? Well, note that Christ and the early Christians believed that the deeper truths of the faith should be revealed in stages. Therefore, differences between the Gospels could reflect the catechetical and pedagogical needs of their initially intended audiences. In short, each Gospel is presenting a small portion of a larger body of truth.